Up until this point, we've been reading the story of Joseph and how his sale into slavery led the Egyptians to actually residing within Egypt, and how that was important to their history. And we also talked a little bit about how that plays into the idea of divine mandate. In verse 1 of 49, we're going to see Jacob addressing people, or his children, before his death. It says, "Then Jacob called his sons and said, 'Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come.'" Now stop right. This is the first time in the Bible where we will have a declared prophecy by man. So you have a few times where God has prophesied and told us the future. And we have a few times where man has said something that ended up being a prophecy. But this is the first time where a man will say, "I am going to give you a prophecy, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the future," and then does so. So this is the first declared prophecy by man. Verse 2, "Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." Now Reuben, if you remember chapter 35, slept with Jacob's concubine. And so that's what he's referring to here, how he defiled his father's bed. And once again, we see a bad thing happen and a consequence of sin happen that God will use as a way to implement his will, right? So as I said, this is the ending of the patriarch system, and in order for that to happen, the 12 tribes of Israel really kind of needed this idea of a fracturing, where each tribe was kind of answerable to itself and to God. And it was, in fact, Reuben's weakness that led to this fracture. Because normally, as the firstborn, all of the leadership as well as the wealth of the entire tribe would have been his. He would have ended up becoming the new patriarch. But because of his lack of moral integrity, he loses that right. And what would have been the firstborn right gets split up among the sons and later on the tribes of Israel. In verse 5, "Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." Now, if we look in I believe this is also 35, is where Simeon and Levi end up killing an entire city of men because their sister was defiled, was raped. So, and it really brings up the question, because it's pretty obvious here that it is seen as sin. That the killing of these men in retribution was in fact a sin. I don't think anyone could argue that point. It's very clear that Jacob feels that way. And my thoughts are the fact that God fulfills this prophecy, and the fact that it is a prophecy, meaning it did come from God, shows us that God saw it as sin. And so it brings up the question, what is an acceptable reason to commit murder? What is an acceptable reason to take a life? Because this was the rape of a family member. And God still saw it as sinful. I won't get into all the arguments or the societal impacts of that question, but I think it's something worth each of us individually thinking about as we study the scriptures. In verse 8, he's going to move on. Judah, your brother, shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down and crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not part from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk. We are literally reading a prophecy concerning the royalty of the tribe of Judah. And so, as anyone who's studied the Old Testament knows, Judah is the tribe of kings. So, King David and everyone following all the way up until Jesus Christ himself will come from the tribe of Judah. It is the tribe of royalty. So, while some will say that this is, in fact, pointing to Jesus Christ coming from the tribe of Judah, and I'm sure on some level it is also talking about the overall purpose of each tribe. And in this case, Judah's purpose is to produce rulers for Israel. In verse 13, Jacob continues, Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be at Sidon. Now, this tribe actually ends up taking the land that falls immediately between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And so they literally have ports on each side of their land. And as a result, they become one of the wealthiest trading tribes in Israel. Verse 14, Issachar is a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good, and that the land was pleasant. So he bowed his shoulders to bear and became a servant at forced labor. Now, I wish that I could show you a map of the tribes of Israel, but if you have one, I invite you to look at it. This tribe ends up finding one of the most fertile, productive lands and most protected lands among the tribes. In fact, they're really well protected by nature and by the other tribes because of its location. As a result, even though they were known to be extremely good fighters, if you look at the history of Israel, the fighters that come from this tribe are always making themselves known in the army. But they are also known to be lazy. They don't become productive. They don't take as active a role in making sure the defense is strong as other tribes do. As a result, they are also the most subjugated tribe among the Israelites. They've become more subjugated than any other tribe. They are constantly being forced into slavery and bondage. Verse 16, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heel so that his rider falls backward. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. So Dan is one of these tribes that's not spoken of a whole lot. Most people know the tribes of Judah and the tribes of the Levites. But Dan actually produces a great many judges. In fact, one of the most well-known judges in the book of Judges comes from this tribe, and that's Samson. And in fact, there's several judges that come from the from the tribe of Dan. In verse 19, raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. Gad is a tribe constantly at war on the fringes of the Israelites, constantly dealing with raiders and enemies coming into their territory. And they dealt with a lot of hardship because of this. But Gad, just like as we talked about with Issachar, Gad is really well known for producing some very strong fighters for the king's army later on. Verse 20, Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Asher, the tribe of Asher, is known not only to produce food. Later on, we'll see that they produce food for the kings more than other tribes. Most of the food that's worthy of trade comes from this tribe. They become extremely gifted in agriculture, specifically crop yield. And so much so that, according to this prophecy, we get the idea that they not only traded basic food items, but also more rare items that only royalty would be able to afford. Verse 21, Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. Verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful bow by a spring. His branches run over the walls. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, by the God of your father, who will help you, by the Almighty, who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of that deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty, beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. And so you see Joseph receives a blessing. I mean, look at the scriptures here. The blessing for Joseph is at the very least 6 times longer than any other tribe is given. I mean, Jacob, and as a result of being the mouthpiece of God, God is heaping blessings on Joseph because of the way that Joseph has handled his life up until now. Verse 27, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoils. As you can tell, a lot of these blessings come in the form of some kind of violence, and we see from in hindsight, and also as we look through the book of the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament, that's pretty much what Israel has for its future. The tribes of Israel will be constantly in war with everyone around them, really, as soon as they leave the land of Egypt. Verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. And he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah's wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now the really interesting thing is, I mean, it's not all that unusual that he would want to be buried in this particular cave. In fact, if you recall the story, this cave, the burying place of the patriarchs, is really the only land that they owned in Canaan. Right? The promised land of God, the land that God told Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that them and their descendants would possess. This cave is the only thing that they possess as of right now. And it's small wonder that they all would like to be buried there. But the interesting thing is, in my opinion, is the idea that a man would breathe his last only when his work is done. The idea that life will continue until I have nothing more that is assigned to me. I struggle a little bit with it because, especially for those of us who've lost somebody, we often hear the phrase that they were taken before their time, or that they passed before their time. But this isn't the only time we're going to see this in Scripture. In fact, there's quite a few people that we see in Scripture both surviving impossible situations and only dying upon finishing their task or finishing their last words. So do any of us really die before our time? Or do we mean to say that we died before we thought they were ready? Or do we mean to say that they died before we were ready for them to die? You see, when we take these euphemisms and we apply them as undeniable universal truths, I think over time we have watered down our understanding of God. In our attempts to understand Him better, oftentimes we end up understanding Him less. And when we take the idea that a man can die before the time that is assigned to him, we kind of take that power out of God's hands. And yet, reading the Bible, we can't help but to come to the conclusion that God has ultimate power over life and death. And a man is taken only when God dictates that he is okay with him being taken. That a man's soul will leave this place only when God deems it so. We read that God is patient, and that He wishes for none to come to destruction, but that all shall be redeemed to Him. Now, I'm paraphrasing here, but the point of it is this: oftentimes we only apply that to the second coming of Christ. We say that that's being put off because of God's patience, and that when God runs out of patience, that's when He will destroy the earth. But looking at some of the people that I've known who have passed away in an unsaved or unredeemed state, kind of makes me wonder if God also looks at His patience concerning us as individuals. And so for those who remain outside the blood of Christ, God will keep you going until He decides that He's done being patient with you. And at that time, you no longer have the option of accepting the grace He promised. Back to the story at hand, we're seeing in Jacob an extreme difference in who we had before. And I pointed this out to you several times through this series, this change within Jacob. But I wanted to point out a statement that he actually makes in the middle of his prophecy. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. Now, looking at different commentators and different resources, there are some who believe that that is actually part of his prophecy for the tribe of Dan. Me personally, when I read it, it seems to me that he has stopped his prophecy and made that statement and then continued on. And it makes me wonder just as I have in the last few chapters, reading different things that Jacob has said, if maybe we haven't failed to see that, to have that same outlook. Seeing our life as a pilgrimage and waiting on the salvation of God. Now, we often refer to ourselves as saved in the past tense. And while I honestly believe there's a definitive reason for that we are absolutely saved past tense, most importantly from the guilt of our sin, do we ultimately see salvation as present and future as well? You see, for those of us who live in a state of innocence provided to us by the waters of baptism, by the blood of Christ, do we also see salvation as a point in the future? You see, while I may be saved from the guilt of my sins, I still suffer living in a world of wickedness, of uncertainty, of pain. A world that I must share with those who do not have good in their hearts. And I really think that it is up to us to look at the day of our own death, our own passing, as a point of salvation. That point in time where God takes us out of that struggle and out of that tribulation, if you will. Removing us from a world we are no longer fit to live in. Or, more accurately, a world that is no longer fit to have us. Because do you realize that that's what happens when you cloak yourself in Christ? Jesus Christ, God, the prophets, they all tell us the same thing. But the world is wicked. The world is corrupted. It is an evil place full of evil men. There is darkness and suffering and sin there. And I really do believe that when we put on the cloak of Jesus Christ, when we put on that innocence that His forgiveness and mercy provides for us, we find that the world is no longer fit, no longer deserving of us to be here. That God in His infinite wisdom allows us to stay a time in order to share that with others so that they too may have a place to go afterwards. Do you wait on the salvation of your Lord? In chapter 50, we won't read all the way through it. I'll go for a brief overview of it, and then we'll be done with the book of Genesis. But after this, Jacob has breathed his last. It then shows a point of mourning for Joseph. In fact, it's a time of mourning for all of Jacob's sons. But what's really cool is if you read through this, and I hope you do on your own time, we will find that Egypt, the country of Egypt, the kingdom of Egypt, mourns for Jacob for 70 days.
You're good.
Now, even by our standards today of, mourning a week is usually the professional mourning. You take a week off from work, yada, yada, yada. 70 days is quite some time to put life on hold and mourn somebody. But what's really interesting is when you look at Egypt's practices, 72 days was the time of mourning allotted for royalty. See, if an emperor died, Egypt would mourn him for 72 days. But this man, who wasn't an Egyptian, as we talked about, was a shepherd, a keeper of livestock, who, as we talked about, Egypt would have disdained and saw as disgusting. Even this man got 70 days of mourning. You see, because it's not just Joseph and his brothers and their families that go up to bury him. There's a great many from Egypt that go up with them also. It's interesting because we have no reason to really believe that any of the Egyptians are ever brought into the fold, converted, started following Yahweh. But it's interesting that a man of God can be so well respected that upon his passing, even the people who have no faith will mourn him. I'm a firm believer that if the men of God live their lives as God has commanded them to, that this is the inevitable result. And they're called to help one another, to love one another, to be there, to carry each other's burdens, to ease the burdens of others, to be honorable in all of our dealings, to work always in everything that we do as if the work is for God Himself. Living this lifestyle will inevitably result in a man who even a worldly person will mourn the passing. You see, when people like this, when men and women like this leave this world, it sometimes seems like the world is darker for their passing. See, but behind them, what the world would normally think of as a legacy, they leave behind the light that was within them, the glory and grace that they learned to shed and to share with other people that God placed within them. That is left behind.